Hi everyone, and welcome back to another conversation with Retha van der Schyf, and we are talking about town transformations. If you go back on the previous episodes, you can see that Retha has discussed in depth radical town transformation, the key players in town transformation, and then I think on the more technical aspects of things as well. And in this episode, we're going to focus on the future of town transformation. When I say town transformation, it's not specifically just referring to town transformation. It's a much bigger thing than that, correct, Retha?
Correct, yes. It also applies equally to cities or regions or, yes, even on a national level in some cases.
What are the biggest trends at the moment when it comes to town transformation?
A lot of trends that we've seen in recent history is deep urbanization. So a lot of people are moving away from rural areas and moving into cities. And that then kind of questions what is the cause of some of these towns that's been drawn empty by people as they migrate into cities, or indeed to what extent must cities be transformed to accommodate this huge influx of population. So I think urbanization, but I think that's one that we're already quite familiar with. Another trend that is also, I think already to a great extent mainstream is this notion of economic development zones, where a lot of town transformations or regional transformations has occurred where people are looking to attract a new base through defining it as an economic development zone. So there's a lot of investment directed to it from a national perspective and quite often a lot of incentives. Sustainability is beginning to play a big role. So to what extent are towns needing to transform because of this impact of perhaps weather impact that makes some towns no longer healthy conditions in which to live, and to what extent could that be altered? So can you create a different way of living that will allow one to still secure a future despite environmental impacts into that area? But I think social sustainability and economic sustainability, I think, becomes factors in the process of decision-making. Where we will see a big impact is where scarcity of natural resources are going to beginning to play a role. So if we will run into water crisis or water quality crises, what will that do for the disbursements of humans and how they migrate and where they will migrate to? The ones that I would want to move to that I think is soon going to play a role, two of them very real, and then maybe a third very aspirational, with this potential notion of some areas where there's population growth decline, or one sometimes can describe it as population implosion. What that means is that, at least for the foreseeable future and for the next few decades, you have an aging population but not enough workforce to actually drive the economy. So how will this need to attract new workforces lead to cities or nations needing to find points of attraction to attract workforces that, despite their perhaps country of origin, will actually leave it to come and instead live somewhere where they have other attraction points that will make it meaningful for them to choose to actually live in a different place. So I think this battle around workforce, future workforce, at the back of population growth decline, is going to be a huge geopolitical player in future considerations. So I think that's one notion. And I think coupled with that will be this whole notion of data, digitization, AI, and how that will divorce that one doesn't necessarily have to live anymore in the place of where you work, because you can actually engage in your professional endeavors from a very different place to where you perhaps socio-culturally or some of your other needs are being satisfied by that sense of place. So I think the world of digitization coupled with remote working and or population implosion, I think, are very up-and-coming trends that will play a big role around the other more obvious ones. And then, of course, there's the controversial notion of, will we actually also move to colonize places beyond Earth?
Yes.
Which takes us to a little bit more of aspirational discussions, which I think, is a point of discussion, but perhaps not a realistic trend to your question.
The interesting thing, what you mentioned now, the two things, I've been really interested in following this thing about was the negative birth rate or the population implosion thing, especially more Eastern nations and your Asian nations and a lot of places in Europe as well. And
your Western societies for sure too.
In Japan, I think they refer to it already as ghost houses. It's neighborhoods with complete neighborhoods with empty houses. Because there's no generational passing down the torch or the
And if some countries don't provide an opportunity to kind of create and hold that sense of national identity or local identity, they might actually lose even more people, not just from the population implosion, but the existing workforces are actually kind of seeing alternative places. And with global mobility actually kind of increasing, I foresee that some workforces, there's already economic migrants that actually move not just because they need to leave for geopolitical social safety, but they leave out of economic choice to say, well, there's better opportunities in this country for me and my family, and therefore I migrate there. So I think that we're going to see a huge increase in that. And that, I think, will put a huge risk to economic stability, of course, to some places. So I think this is one that holds a lot of exciting opportunity, but also, I think, a lot of risk for many countries that are not awake to how will they retain and develop workforces that can actually secure the existing population, or you will see a true population collapse, which will, of course, bring about a lot of other social issues that is perhaps a little bit less pleasant to think about.
If I have to, or if I may make a projection, if I channel my own inner futurist a bit, I would actually think, because Africa is still actually the one place where there's still a very it's got a very healthy birth rate. And I think the rest of the world will start tapping more into Africa, and I think we will see a lot more people from African nations living abroad.
Absolutely. And then, of course, that on the short term will bring a lot of wealth and perhaps a social upliftment. But then again, what does it do to the national states that they leave behind? So, their places of birth is what I'm referring to. So, so there will be a knock-on effect, and there will be this musical chairs of who can actually offer the most to attract what would be a shrinking workforce. Of course, a lot of that will be replaced, and of course, technology will do a lot of these, perhaps value creation roles that some, employees at the moment fulfill. But yes, I think there will still be a gap, and I think that's a very interesting space to watch. A complicated space for sure. I think that's a world problem that's developing.
Yes. It's going to be an interesting future nonetheless.
Exactly.
Another thing about colonizing outside of our own planet. I find a lot of things that are currently science fact started in science fiction.
Absolutely. It's I like that you raised that point. I can only watch a few movies that one watched only a few years ago. Some of that is becoming quite real, and I'm beginning to question, is that manifestation in some way?
Yes, exactly that.
Absolutely. I agree with you.
So the term sustainability gets thrown around a lot. How big of a role does it play in town transformation?
I think hugely, and I think it will increasingly do so. There is perhaps a very strong focus that has been put on environmental sustainability in the last few years and few decades, in fact. It's really obviously been building over quite a serious amount of time. But I do think this notion about economic sustainability, now that we see some of the economic platforms that had growth only recently beginning to shrink or at least stagnate, is beginning to kind of raise this question, well, what does economic sustainability look like, and who's responsible for that, and how do we achieve that? Because it is a big destabilizer if most of your populations can't access points of economic sustainability. And I'm not even talking about economic progression. I'm talking about minimum standards of living. So I think economic sustainability is going to become a huge player in time to come. And then the all-important social sustainability. How do we make sure that there's greater levels of inclusion, greater levels of equality, greater levels of social resilience, so that as pace of change come about, that we've got this ability as societies and communities to adapt fast for purposes of sustainability. So I do think that, yes, it's a ambiguous term, and in many ways it could be described as hollow phraseology, but I do think the principles or the essence that it represents is increasingly important. I'm usually encouraged by the government of Namibia that's also using the language of sustainability, or even more specific language around ESG or principles of that speaks to principles of making sure that what we have and our resources that we have are used in a way that it can last. So yes, I think very much so, and increasingly so.
I think also Namibia is a good example of, given the sheer size of the country and the absolute tiny population we have, I think it could be a good example to actually show what real sustainability
yes, your insight on that, because you've got such a small, almost the fortune of having such a small population is that on the one hand, you actually have this potential to be a lot more agile and adaptive and almost kind of become that case study that can actually evidence if you actually can corral your population, your society, and all parts of the ecosystem work together, that you can get to real standards of sustainability. In fact, you already got a fantastic case history now that you mentioned that on conservation of, in your conservation practices, you were really innovative and actually through a smaller population could co-opt your communities to actually help the process of achieving conservation, which was hugely innovative in its day, and I think is still being looked at as a state of innovation. So in fact, you've already done it, I think is what I'm saying in an environmental context. So yes, hopefully you can do it on economic and social levels too.
Conservation was actually a key part of the Constitution when it was written.
Absolutely, and what incredible foresight was that. So
yes,
it's already speaking to that notion that you pointed out. Yeah.
Concerning the private sector and everything that we've mentioned now, do you think that the private sector is being expected to take on certain roles that were previously associated with the public sector?
I can say with a greater degree of certainty that I think increasingly so. When the world was, let's say only as sort of recent as 1940-ish, we were about 2.8 billion people. It's predicted that in the current trajectory, despite the population implosion or slowed growth we spoke about earlier, that is predicted by 2050 that we will have a population profile of 9.5 billion people. Now, that rate of growth is extraordinary. If you think that public sector was designed to govern in a very different context, I don't think one can in the future expect of the public sector to alone carry the burden to ensure a normalized environment in which all elements of society thrive. So I do think from a funding perspective, from a skill set perspective, from a leadership perspective, from a thought leadership perspective, from a skill set perspective, there will and needs to be a greater reliance of the private sector to partner the public sector and or to play, perhaps without taking over the role, of course, of public sectors. I'm not saying that, but to play a much stronger role in areas of what we historically would have seen or subscribed to be a public sector responsibility might now become a quasi-private and public sector responsibility. So I see that private sector will increasingly, and you're already seeing it in terms of social equality and social inclusion, economic development, the expectation to kind of begin to create more jobs, to not just focus on its efficiency, but rather how do we keep the economy stable. I think those elements is where the private sector will play an increasingly strong development role and partner the government.
What are the most crucial environmental aspects that we cannot ignore?
We cannot ignore that there has definitely been global warming impact. There's undeniably impacts that are happening. We definitely have some of our fossil fuels are being exhausted. We do seeing the kind of absolute insistence on decarbonization. We see measures that the earth is warming and warming to dangerous levels. And then, of course, as our host, we're kind of beginning to undermine or challenge that. So in the spirit of town transformations, it's critical that you embed environmental principles in how you go about transform the town. But I think what is going to be more important is that notion that we've touched on earlier, is that perhaps some areas will become inhabitable, and that might lead to the need to actually shift where towns or future cities are actually created as a consequence of this environmental impact, but possibly more so as a consequence of environmental degradation, where what we see is their threat to scarce resources, which I think will create possibly even flashpoints or competition around who will actually focus density around access to scarce resources. So I think it's in that space that I think that environmental sustainability and or environmental impact will begin to play a role on the impetus of where towns and cities and how towns and cities are transformed. So that's kind of possibly on a macro level. On a more micro level, where I can already see some shifts happening, is that on a very micro level, you'd see that there's movements in how city planners and or developers are already incorporating new disciplines of building material, the use of building, how they engage with scarce resources in and around these buildings, whether it's residential, ideally commercial, and or beyond, where they're looking to kind of use grey water, for example, in making sure that water use is optimized and used mindfully, and or perhaps where spaces are being used where perhaps solar panels are being used on roofs to make sure we use renewable sources increasingly and not wasteful in terms of how we actually go about with our environment as we build environments in which people live. I think environment sort of impact that we'll see or increasingly see already in Namibia also, or southern African countries or hot countries. I'm also seeing it in Greece, is where cladding is being placed on the outside of buildings to actually provide better insulation. So heat disbursement is more mindfully considered. So I think it's going into architectural principles, it's going into urban principles, it's going into law, but it's also going into macro movements around communities and how they developed and how they're being planned for. So I think it's quite pervasive already.
That is super interesting. And I think it's also, I mean, it's a bit older already, not the newest thing, but to construct skyscrapers with taking, for instance, indigenous plant life into consideration.
Absolutely.
I think they're called green buildings.
Exactly that. And I think, New York is also, I mean, who would have thought 20 years ago that a city like New York that is so associated with economic development and, it's kind of turning into actually, like you just say, green agriculture, where spaces on the rooftops of New York is being used to actually develop produce that could, otherwise would have expected to be in rural areas.
The interesting thing about how things will change now in the future is I think the most immediate communities that are in danger, or not even in danger, is a fact how they're being impacted by global warming, rising sea levels, coastal towns and island nations.
Some of your low-level places are at risk, but also equally higher places, and that kind of exposed to perhaps extreme weather conditions that make that unsafe. So yes, now I think we've got some real challenges if we don't direct the environmental impacts.
How important is technology in the creation of towns?
I think, again, it's going to become increasingly important. Of course, technology will have this technology, and I think in my case, I look at technology as one component, but the other side of it is data. So I think without a doubt, the use of data will become a big thing in terms of becoming more innovative and creative in terms of how data is used to understand the movement and behavior of people, to understand the opportunities for optimization. So I think especially in the use of scarce resources and or with the mobility of people and security of people and ease of supporting people through their day-to-day life, I think the optimization of cities and its fundamental functioning will be hugely enhanced through data. The use of technology in order to access data is playing a huge role and is an incredible contributor to how you would kind of look at these notions of sustainability. The other way that I kind of would, however, also look at your notion to say is that although I'm a big proponent of the use of data, that's for sure a critical, vital attribute that will allow us to make decisions, better decisions, hopefully. You would have to be a little bit mindful that you kind of just make sure that the data doesn't land in the wrong hands and that the data is actually misused. There's lots of debates to what extent our, as consumers and as social media users and technology users, some of our behavioral patterns are already used, where in a way, one could argue that some of that is actually proprietary data to me, but it's being used by others to actually direct commercial strategies. And in the same way, one could look at political strategies are actually perhaps increasing being influenced through technology. So there's, I think, a little bit of a danger zone where the use of data is perhaps not going to be optimal in the interest of the citizenship always, and therefore the governance of it would be very important. The other piece that's a little bit more closer to me, especially when you deal with smaller environments, but it's not necessarily untrue for bigger environments, is although data is a vital role, if you increasingly divorce and just look at data quite coldly without actually immersing yourself in the environment and the understanding the context of that environment, one may actually be able to kind of become more clinical around the application of the data. That is not always going to be helpful. So I think that visceral immersion to truly understand and speak to people and rely to stories and to incorporate a very real experience alongside the data, I don't think one should ever allow data to replace that aspect, to kind of truly understand. Data can tell stories, very important stories, vital stories that will lead to efficiency, that will lead to optimization. But I think, like your earlier question in one of our earlier podcasts, it quite can't replace human storytelling.
Yes.
Some people might argue that AI is already doing that, but I do think there is still some emotive translation that happens in storytelling that is human focused, that makes you viscerally and emotionally and energetically respond. And I think that shouldn't be lost.
The humanity of it.
The humanity of it, I think, yes. After all, that's why we build places,
yes.
to cater for humanity,
yes.
so you can't ever and should never divorce yourself from it. On the technology side, equally, I think we will see a lot of innovation around how newer concepts that was perhaps inconceivable in the past. So perhaps maybe the notion, which might not be a popular example to use, but let's say dry toilets, and how that would work, and how we will become accustomed to that as opposed to flashing with water that becomes grey water. So I think technology innovation in terms of how it is used to serve humanity, but also to help bring about optimization of resources and the use of resources, I think will be a huge, huge thing in the future.
There's on the thing about technology, I saw this years ago, and it seems like something that's being implemented more. It's for the lack of a better word, it's a giant device that's placed in very arid regions or desert areas like ours, and it extracts water from
moist.
Yeah,
so mist harvesting. Yes. So no, absolutely very familiar with that concept. We kind of considered that, especially in Oranienburg and Luritz, where you have these thick mist belts that sometimes the airports can't actually kind of receive airplanes, or you can't actually physically land because it doesn't have the equipment to do with radar landing. But yes, couldn't that possibly be harvested, especially in a desert country? Yes. I am, however, of the school of thought, and perhaps to that point, desalination processes and to what extent all sorts of water preservation, conservation, optimization can happen. I think the only thing is, as somewhat of a futurist, one has to just be very careful that these newer technologies that we adopt, that we also kind of do consider and learn from hindsight the unintended consequences. So to what extent is some of the solutions actually creating new problems? So one just has to think through to that. I mean, of course, technology's got a huge role to play, so I don't want for a moment to undermine it. But I think one also just has to think carefully. And if you know that it is short-term and you do know that there might be unintended consequences, that you do that with consciousness.
Yes.
And not blindly following perhaps some approaches that in the short term might seem attractive, but then in hindsight could have created other challenges that are equally hard to solve.
And this is what you mentioned with responsibility for futurists, is to look to what has been done before and learn from it.
Correct, absolutely.
And apply it responsibly.
Correct, and also ideally look far into the future and try and look back and say, what might be the consequences, and if we had known this, would we still choose it? And yes, that would be challenging thinking. So I think we need to apply ourselves to it, not just from an egotistical perspective, pursue, or from an ease and efficiency and economic optimization. There's lots of other impacts, whether it's the environment or social impacts or social psychology impacts. What happens if we actually have limited job opportunities because so much of it is automated? What would humanity do with their time? I'm not saying that's not something that can't be solved, but I think we need to just think carefully and not uninformed pursue these avenues without thinking of unintended consequences.
It's living day to day, futuristically, with a lot of hypothetical situations.
Absolutely. And I think that pace is only going to increase. And I think that does give us a little bit of existential pressure.
Are some countries more attuned to this intangible concept of future generations?
I would like to say that the answer to that is absolutely yes. And I might kind of answer the question from a slightly different perspective and rather speak to, yes, to what extent are they kind of more embracive of this intangible concept of future generations, but also kind of how adaptive are they in general, before perhaps asking that very specific element. So I kind of do think countries that I kind of think might be more adaptive to change and kind of, therefore developing their countries in a certain direction would be countries that are perhaps, at least on the surface, less tied to their current identity. So it's countries that can actually allow the shedding of identity faster than others. So the Western societies, in my opinion, for good or bad, might be quite beholden to their existing identity into which they tie themselves, where your Middle Eastern countries, maybe because of size of population, because of the environmental context, are more willing to actually reinvent. I think the other places where I kind of see where there's a little bit more adaptation to this general notion of advanced thinking that may or may not include future generations are countries that are very pro-entrepreneurship and innovation. The country that I will mention is India, which one wouldn't really quite expect, but it's a country that I think is very adaptive to new technologies. South Korea is one that I think recently would put on the on the radar for a country that is also very entrepreneurial and adaptive to understanding where the future world is going and responding to that in a very creative way. But I think the countries that can really lean itself to this adoption of securing a future generation, I think the countries that stand out for me, they might be the Scandinavians. And I think for that is that they just have such a long history of sustainable wealth creation that a huge part of their population has actually kind of been able to almost secure their basic needs pervasively. There are very few people in Scandinavia that lives below the poverty line. And therefore, they almost, dare I say, if we want for a moment, draw on Maslow's hierarchy, they've got their basic needs of, survival needs and or security needs covered. And therefore can almost afford this, sort of actualization to think of themselves and beyond. And therefore, I kind of think that they might be a good example that could afford and therefore be more embracing of that notion. But I think it's going to slowly be a trend that would spread not on a wealth basis, but on a sustainability and necessity basis rather than a choice basis.
And I think when you mention Scandinavian countries, I think Finland has a very interesting history.
Exactly. They've got a very deep history of social wealth creation.
Yeah, and how they also, because you could correct me if I'm wrong, but they also, essentially Finland faced bankruptcy at one point.
Yes.
And they changed it around completely.
Correct.
And that's probably also
a contributing factor is what you've gone to an existential threat.
Yeah.
But then can you establish the means through which to create that? Yes, you're absolutely right. I forgot about that.
Mm-hmm.
And then I kind of think you also begin to understand the value. And I think what is really great, what you remind me of the Finland case is, in that case, they also had a very strong trust relationship that could create between the public and the voting population, and therefore aligned around a very clear strategy. And then people do pay higher taxes because they've got a deep sense of trust that investment of higher taxes is actually evidencing in terms of social benefits and in terms of environmental sustainability and economic development and a sense of safety on a national level. So I think that is one of the tipping points that also allowed them to kind of embrace that. So, yeah. And I think what is also for me interesting from the Scandinavian cultural perspective is also their pace of decision-making, or rather, let me requalify, the process of decision-making is slightly less emotive.
Yes,
they're a lot more output-orientated and therefore pragmatic almost in their decision-making and sensible as a consequence, which I think is some of the Western cultures, or perhaps dare say some of the African cultures, is held back a little bit by nostalgia and or emotive decision-making, or perhaps previous, very important but yet past political rhetoric.
Yes.
That kind of then gets in the way of these kind of more decision-making that hinges on real fact and future prospects as opposed to past prospects.
It's almost stoic.
Almost too stoic.
Almost too stoic.
Stoic to a fault. Exactly.
Some towns and cities gear themselves towards the slick, glitzy, modern tech cities. Is this appealing to people? Do places lose some of their soul, if we could put it that way? And how perfect or sterile do we want towns or cities to be?
That's quite a lot of questions, I think, bundled there. So let me begin to say is, the attraction of these environments that you've just described, I don't want to necessarily judge that, because I think, different people or different parts of society might be very much attracted to that particular environment and others might be not. So I do think that cities might, or some cities and places might faster adopt this notion of real slick innovation and almost cleanliness. Some people might describe that as being sterile, but again, some people might be very attracted to that notion. In terms of the focus on would that mean that a place has lost its soul, again, that's very subjective opinion of what soul means. For my generation, or for me, it might still be that I want to have a sense of, very much an environmental experience where I can walk barefoot on grass and where I can connect with the community, and that's almost an active desire of mine. But I do know that there's a lot of people that are very much moving towards the kind of, almost integration with digitization and very much attracted to that, and, go as far as to say that human interaction is not at all what they see.
Yeah.
And yes, I could think that might be a soulless existence, but who am I to form that judgment? As humanity evolve, that might be part of where our future world will include elements where that is a very firm reality of some of the options on the table or on the menu of where you could pick of where you want to actually ultimately in what way you want to live. the one part that, I want to kind of express on that comes a little bit more from the social psychology perspective is I think we might kind of be attracted to the ease of living and the comforts that come with that. But I think the sense of agency that is lost in that, or perhaps, the social well-being that is part of that, I'm not quite sure if our human evolution is going to have enough time to adapt to that as fast as the technology is. So it might be that we are actually paying a price for the adoption of these options without really yet knowing it, because it's almost like the frog in the boiling water.
Yes.
Yes, it feels, the frog would find it attractive to be in boiling water. But let's say you might be giving up stuff without knowing that because it's slowly eroding your sense of belonging and connectivity, and what that does for you as a human to kind of have less and less of that gradually, and to live in more and more sterilized and more technology-driven places might be a price we are paying. Who knows? We will find out in future. But I think the whole pervasiveness of mental health, and that being already part of our language and lexicon and awareness is much more than it was 20 years ago, does kind of give for me a notion that might already be happening.
Yes.
That less of soulful connection, sense of place, sense of belonging, sense of connectivity, and that breakdown, that we are paying potentially some price for that already.
I think you're absolutely right. And you cannot, I think there's a lot of aspects, I just want to mention this, a lot of aspects where people, we have to say we as people, because it is a collection, we think we are different or remove ourselves from the environment which we were born into when all of this started in the first place. And I think cities give the illusion of safety and comfort, especially if it's a highly advanced.
Absolutely.
And it's exactly those things that you mentioned, those things that are pertinent to our existence, to our survival, start fading away. And I think it is important to maintain a sense of alertness. And actually, and this is my personal philosophy as well, never really to be comfortable, because you need to maintain what makes you human, actually.
Absolutely. And to kind of fiercely almost protect that, maybe, it might be that we get to places in way of futures beyond my capability that, we might lose that battle. There's definitely people that are ready for telling that. Mm-hmm. But again, I still want to believe that we've got still quite a good runway to influence that trajectory. And I think, our mental and social wealth and social consciousness and the desire for that is going to be a stronghold that might kind of lead to influence that outcome. So I very much agree with you on that space.
Some of us still want our children to know what trees look like. That's the statement I have here.
And I would again argue to say, well, some of us would. So I think probably most people would say vote yes on that. But I want to actually answer your statement by perhaps just a rude awakening that I was recently encountered with, where a friend of mine has a 12, 13, 14-year-old son. And like many parents, I'm sure they share this kind of losing battle of getting their son off video games. Mm-hmm. And Dominique receives pocket money, like some lucky children are lucky to receive. And he spends all of that pocket money to create an avatar, to dress his avatar, to address his virtual identity, to feed it, to provide it safety, depending on what the game strategies all require, instead of investing any of that money on fashionable clothes for himself, mm-hmm. and posters, as all of us might have done when we were teenagers. And that's perhaps a way that I would answer your question, if there's already a generation that's coming through that has a huge disassociation of actually my real world and really buying into a virtual reality. Maybe the answer would be yes, some of us might still hold on to that notion to want to introduce our trees to children, and some of them want it, but their children are making different choices and actually divorced of the meaning of that. I'm not saying that that's necessarily where it's going to land, but I think there's a possibility that might not be something that everybody aspires to or has the luxury to aspire mm-hmm. to, even if we have the fortune of choice. So yes, who knows?
It's very interesting in that sense.
It's very interesting if you look at it from that perspective.
Retha, and on that final note, I think you just pointed out the especially in young people now being born. I remember a time also without cell phones, and it's now such an integral part of society.
Absolutely.
And I think cell phones are getting to a point where they, with AI now specifically and new devices, where they will get to a point where it's obsolete. Yeah. But the point being, younger people, children, are now being born into a world where the digital era and everything they're born into this existence with it.
Correct. A very different future, very different future that they will see and live in. And I think the pace at which that will change, I think, will be even astound us.
Yes.
In terms of that's already seen so much technology innovation in our time. So yes, I kind of foresee a lot of that happening, and where people then therefore divorce themselves, at least on some level, from what they perceive to be connectivity and to a sense of place.
And then that means that you and I have a very big responsibility to ensure that, again, like you mentioned, the preference of choice, but also to actually encourage and inform that there is a clear difference between what is real and what is digital or virtual.
Correct. And that might be an exciting learning experience.
And I think that is that alone can be a huge topic to discuss.
Yes, exactly.
In the future.
Absolutely.
But I want to take this moment to thank you for the opportunity that we could sit and talk. And
thank you very much for your time. For a discussion, which I thoroughly enjoyed.
Yes.
So thank you very much.
So do I. I don't think the viewers know this specifically. This is a bit of a marathon series today. But thank you for the opportunity. It was extremely insightful. And I think anybody watching this will agree that there was a lot of information. And there is a lot of information to process. But thank you for taking the time.
Absolutely.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to ask you these questions. And I hope to sit with you in future conversations again.
Exactly. Thank you so much, Jaco. Really appreciated the time. It was fantastic. Thank you.